if you insist on having the mathematical physicist view of the world, and you insist that in the end it is all of that nature, you could imagine writing down an equation for everything that composes of your body. And I would contend there is effectively an infinite number of equations that it would require, which would mean it's useless.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart, here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast number 164. And this episode is with Geoffrey West, who is Shannan Distinguished Professor and past president at the Santa Fe Institute. So Geoffrey is a theoretical physicist who has worked broadly on topics related to elementary particles, like string theory, which parenthetically he informs me is very difficult, and then their cosmological implications. But he's also worked on a lot of other topics, which, as you'll hear, is one reason he's at the quite renowned interdisciplinary Santa Fe Institute. And among these topics are complexity theory, which we get into, and then scaling laws in biology, which we also get into. So we discuss questions like why animals, regardless of their size, all tend to have the same number of heartbeats in a lifetime, why cities don't die the way that biological organisms do, and then all sorts of other fun stuff like that, much of which can be found in Geoffrey's 2017 book Scale, which you'll find a link to in the description. I have to mention that likes, reviews, subscribes, follows, comments, all of these things are endlessly appreciated. And now, without any further ado, I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Geoffrey. You're a past president and current distinguished professor of the Santa Fe Institute, which I think of as a melting pot of interdisciplinary research. And in that sense, you seem emblematic of the SFI, since you're a theoretical physicist by training, but also a complexity theorist working on scaling in biology, cities and sustainability, and more. So before we get into some of that material, I wanted to ask how your research evolved from particle physics at the microscopic scale to modeling cities at the macroscopic, and why the Institute has become your home.
Well, yes, that's a big question, and I'll try to keep it brief, and you should feel very free to interrupt me if I ramble on too much, which I tend to do. So as you say, I mean, I was, I still identify myself very much as a theoretical physicist. That's what I do as a living kind of thing, and the way I think about the world. And I spent most of my career doing what's called high energy physics, elementary particle physics, fundamental questions in physics, quarks and gluons and string theory, and something about, origins of the universe and so forth. So, and that was fantastic, and I enjoyed it very much. But I was always, I realized, slightly frustrated most of my career, because I think, when I went into academia, migrated into academia, I kept a sort of romantic image of entering a community of scholars that would be interested in all kinds of problems and so on. And of course, that doesn't happen. Academia is quite the opposite to that. In fact, it deconstructs and focuses. Siloed very strongly. I might have been a member of a physics department, but physics department these days are actually an agglomeration of half a dozen, essentially, semi-autonomous sub-departments, and those divide into groups. So the whole thing has become quite structured and siloed, as you say. And that's been enormously successful, no question. But nevertheless, it meant that, in terms of career advancement at whatever level you're at, you have to focus on one specific thing within one specific area. And that was kind of frustrating to me in a kind of mild way, but it was always there. But then two things happened kind of simultaneously without me realizing. One was that I was getting old, and I began to realize it. Old meant I was in my 50s, mid-50s. And, you sort of begin to feel it at that age, I think. And I come from a short-lived line of males. Most of them die in their even late 50s, early 60s. Occasionally, someone has reached as high as 70. But my father died at 61, my grandfather at 57, and so on. And so I just from my family, I didn't expect to live much beyond my early 60s, which meant that when I got into my 50s, I was cognizant of death. And that I was always sort of fascinated by that. And I'd been much influenced by the Ingmar Bergman film, The Seventh Seal, when I was about 15 years old. And that continues to influence me, but which deals with death in a very poetic and profound way, I think. But at the same time, there was another kind of death process going on, as I look back on it. And that was, it was a birth and death process. There was this proposal to have this big superconducting supercollider in Texas, which was going to cost anywhere from, well, I don't know what the original estimate was, of the order of $10 billion. So some humongous amount of money, and it was very controversial, both within the scientific community, but even within the physics community, it was controversial that this was going to sort of dominate everything. And eventually, with the rise of a kind of anti-science, anti-intellectual, but anti-science, and in particular, anti-physics kind of culture that was arising in the 90s. To cut a long story short, that project was killed under the Clinton administration. And many of us felt that this might be the death of fundamental physics. And in fact, often it was put in those terms. Physics was the science. Physics was the science of the 19th and 20th centuries. Biology will be the science of the 21st century. And there was a kind of, usually unsaid, but sometimes said, we don't need any more physics, really. Fundamentally, we know it all. We know enough, which is kind of ridiculous. And that was around and quite profound. And that ended up killing the SSC, the superconducting supercollider. And that gave me pause, and especially that comment, which was bandied around willy-nilly, about biology being the science of the 21st century, and that physics was kind of finished, which kind of I found bizarre. Of course, I'm a physicist, so I no doubt was highly defensive. And I felt that was completely ridiculous. And I started going around saying, well, if biology were a real science, it would have to have real principles beyond just, in quotes, the Darwinian theory of natural selection. It would have to have real principles that can be mathematized and be predictive and be quantified and blah, blah, blah. And to do that, it needs to start to, much more than it had, integrate, borrow from, absorb ideas, techniques, and people from physics. It needs to be, of course, I knew no biology. It was kind of ridiculous statement for me to make, given that I knew no biology. But I just sort of blurted this out from time to time. And, but at some stage, I thought, that is ridiculous, me saying it, since I don't know any biology. Maybe I should actually put money where my mouth is. And so these two things came together, this kind of personal interest in aging and mortality, and this, if you like, this death of the SSC. And I decided, it's kind of interesting exercise might be to see if I can understand something about death, which, as I said, always fascinated me anyway. And I started doing some reading, and very quickly I discovered that mortality, aging and death in particular, were total backwaters in the entire field of biology. There is, of course, and there's a National Institute of Aging, but that's to do with dealing with people like me who are near death and how do you take care of them. It's not how do we understand the process, the biology, the fundamental science, or much less so about that. So I started reading about it and discovered, as I say, it was a backwater and there was no real theory and it was all kind of very qualitative and so on from a physicist viewpoint. And then the thing that really got me was that even though, of course, there were qualitative discussions about, why do we die and so on, no one had asked the question, as far as I could tell, why is it 100 years? That's a physicist question. Why not 10 years? That is the lifespan. Why 70 or whatever it is in the Bible? Or why not 1,000,000 years? I mean, what is it that's constraining all this stuff? And so I was surprised, and I was particularly surprised, by the way, that it turned out my kids were in high school, maybe freshmen in college, and they had these big fat biology books, these things that have all of biology in them. And they're really actually very good. If you want to, they're quite good, some of them, I have to say. So there were 3 of them in the house, and I looked through each of them and looked up about aging and mortality, death. None of them even mentioned it. And I thought, my God, what a bizarre science. The second most important thing in the life history of any organism is death. And there's no mention of it. There's mention of birth and development and all the rest of the things, of course, genes and ecosystems and so on. But death, dying and death, which is absolutely central to natural selection. I mean, as Darwin himself emphasized many times, that if you don't die, there's no process. So here it was that, and I thought, well, this is great. This is something I can actually start thinking about. Well, that changed. It turned out, unbeknownst to me, that changed my life because what I did was I realized I had this idea. Look, if a system is decaying, so to speak, aging, and then is then falling apart and becomes totally dysfunctional. In order to understand that, you better understand what it is that was making it functional in the first place and keeping it alive, so you can figure out what the hell is going wrong or what could go wrong. And that, of course, in organisms is called metabolism. So I started to learn about metabolism. And I learned, which I sort of vaguely already knew, about these extraordinary scaling laws in biology, which are truly remarkable. And I learned that there was this extraordinary one in metabolism called Kleiber's law, which maybe we can talk about a little bit later, maybe. But there was just a systematic, just the whole point here was there was a quantitative law that told you how metabolic rate, the amount of food, the amount of energy an organism needs to stay alive per day, how that changes with the size of the organism. And what blew my mind was that it was completely regular. It was absolutely regular. It was almost like it had been designed by the great engineer in the sky. And I thought, boy, that's interesting. And then it turns out there's loads of these scaling laws, and they had been known beginning in the 30s and developed well into the 30s and 40s and in the 50s. And there was great interest. And then they sort of died because the molecular evolution came along and DNA, discovery of the structure of DNA, and the whole emphasis of biology turned to microscopic phenomena. And this sort of stayed just in the realm of ecology. So I started thinking about those scaling laws, and the great surprise to me there again was that there was no theory. And here was something that was completely antithetical to the naive image of what natural selection is. There's this image that, okay, there's these organisms, they compete with each other, there's all these accidents that happen. I mean, it depends on the details of the environmental niche and all kinds of, accidents that might happen to do with the environment and their history. And then you end up with what we see, which is some sort of arbitrary and chaotic mess that is out there. And that's what life is on the planet. That's what the biosphere is. Well, these scaling laws are saying the exact opposite. It says, no, actually, somehow there is some constraint at work, which in the most naive form would be that someone designed the bloody thing. But there's some constraint at work that is lining these things up so that when you plot any physiological variable, the most prominent being metabolic rate, but it could be the length of aortas, it could be, lifespan, could be diffusion of oxygen across some membrane. I mean, whatever it is, 75, 100 of these laws, they all look simple, and yet here we are dealing with the most complex and diverse system possibly in the universe, and here they're expressing something extraordinarily simple in terms of their quantitative measures, meaning their physiology and their life histories, which is pretty much is a significant part of what biology is all about. So that was great because it meant that since no one was working on it, I could sort of fiddle and futz around in the evenings when I wasn't struggling with string theory, which is exceedingly difficult, and I just wasn't up to it, I realized. But these other problems I could think about, and that was interesting of itself. By the way, just a kind of interesting point here is that in the field I was in, we knew what the big questions were. We know what the problem is to solve. We know it's just extremely hard to solve it, extremely hard to put it together, to mathematize it. What I began to discover in biology, it wasn't clear what the question was. What were we actually trying to answer here? This happened to be one. So I had one. Why do we live 100 years and not 1 million or 10? That was the question. And I started working on it, and I eventually came up with an answer. I could derive it. And at that time, I was introduced to a wonderful scientist, biologist, very well-known ecologist named Jim Brown, who had just recently moved to New Mexico and was sort of associated with the Santa Fe Institute, which I knew about. I had many friends there, but was not associated with it. And that's what got me involved with the Santa Fe Institute in a professional fashion. And that, even though I stayed doing high energy physics, I was running a big group at the time, Los Alamos, and I stayed involved in that for several more years, thinking that this detour in biology was just some kind of, dilettantish, kind of interesting hobby to make me feel good about the death of the SSC and so on, and show those biologists that we physicists have something to contribute. In fact, it led to me effectively changing fields and becoming it's sort of interesting in a way, becoming the kind of scientist that I really wanted to be when I started out, sort of interested in all questions and being able to take the toolbox that I had and the kind of conceptual frameworks that I work with and applying them across the entire spectrum of science, from the microscopic up to the macroscopic. And, that has been, I feel incredibly blessed and thankful that I was able to do it quite late in my career. I mean, relatively speaking, late in my career. But I did it it was not a conscious decision, frankly. It was just sort of following my nose and serendipity, to be honest.
A few comments, though, about what you said before we move on. One, you mentioned your disillusionment about your hope to enter a community of scholars that was going to be addressing all sorts of questions, and then finding that that's not really how academia works. Before we started talking, you asked a bit about philosophy, and that's one of the reasons that I was attracted to modern philosophy, is that within a philosophy department, you can be asking questions about metaphysics or the philosophy of physics or the philosophy of math. So a philosophy department still retains this this universality, I suppose. But one problem, though, is that not everybody, there are only a couple of people in the department you can talk about with
Right.
regard to a
No,
certain
I'm
question.
familiar with that a little bit. By the way, the thing about the Santa Fe Institute, I didn't say they didn't complete it. We could talk about it a little bit. But the wonderful thing that I knew about, of course, I had been to the Santa Fe Institute. I knew it. I had many friends there, people who ran it. But it was that community, and that's what it is. It is a community of scholars covering the complete spectrum of science, and indeed philosophy and the humanities to some small degree. I mean, we've hired over the last years, every year we've hired at least one philosopher, someone coming out of, like yourself, out of graduate school in philosophy, and we have we have distinguished visitors who are from the humanities because we think that's important. Even if just to hang around and bullshit, so to speak, but that's part of what the Institute is a place precisely to facilitate and encourage all kinds of conversations, whether they're about some detailed problem or some flaky big picture about, the universe or AI or consciousness or whatever.
And then just to continue with my stream of consciousness and comments, I am very much looking forward to getting to human death and scaling. And it is just so bizarre. I took 3 years of biology in high school, and you're right that these books are quite good, but I don't recall reading a thing about death other than, cell senescence, but that's not the sort of death that you're talking about.
No, you're absolutely right. That's the one place that death is, you sort of touches on it, that cells have a finite lifetime.
And then the last comment I'd like to make is that this quantification and physicization, so to speak, of biology that you were advocating is exactly the approach you've taken to the study of cities, which we'll get to later, which is particularly fascinating. But okay, now that I've got that out of the way, since complexity and the work of the SFI haven't come up on the show, and because this is going to be relevant for our conversation, there are at least 2 key terms I'd like to hear how you think about before we go on. And the first is emergence, which different people seem to use to different effects and for different reasons. And I guess I'm wondering how you like to define or think of emergent phenomena or properties.
Yes, well, one of the things about complexity and the terms that have arisen in it, like emergence being one in particular, that they're hard to define, and I've stopped trying to, quote, define them. It's very much, a platitude, but it's like, I know it when I see it kind of idea. I feel that about complexity. Emergence also, but it can be a little more specific, I think. Simply put, I guess, is that, most of the systems we look at when we first look at them are usually collectives of various kinds, whatever they are, whether they're everything from, the earth itself to societies, to cities, to down to materials, to molecules and atoms. And part of the success of science is, in fact, that kind of deconstructing and that reduction to more and more finer scales and looking at the finer levels of their constituents. And that's been an ongoing quest, which I say has been, I would say, enormously successful. But less so has been the sort of going up and the recognition that, and there's been implicit in that idea, maybe I should have added this, implicit in this idea is that if you break it down and you understand, you find out what the constituents are, that, the nucleus of an atom is made up of neutrons and protons. So now, okay, that's great. If we now study the properties of neutrons and protons, we can stick them together. Now we understand all the properties of nuclei because we can, and then we take, and then from that we can add the electrons, we understand the atoms, and then molecules, and then up we can understand chemistry and blah, blah, blah. So physics has always had, and certainly when I came through in graduate school and in most of my career, implicit that the idea that you can, get the properties of the collective, understand the collective, the many-body system, from the properties of its underlying constituents, and in fact, as I say, just a side comment to that within physics, there was sort of this unsaid kind of idea that's why, physics is the most fundamental, and all you got to know is the basic equations, and then, the rest is engineering. So that was very much the attitude, and it might have even been said from time to time, but it was certainly the way physicists behaved. And I would say I was among them. And but then what you begin to realize is that, in most systems, that's simply not the case at all. I mean, the kind of systems I work on now, you are not the sum of all your cells. I mean, you can't just add up all those cells and get, Robinson out of it. You're much more than that. And, a city is more than just all of its people, all of its roads, all of its buildings. You could even categorize everything. And somehow this idea that you could stick it together, and in 2023, there's even the idea that if you put all those together, fed it into a computer, said some magic words like machine learning and AI, turned a crank, out would come all the properties of cities or companies or institutions. I mean, it's kind of a ludicrous idea, but it does conceptually have a lot of weight that people act on, unfortunately. So emergence are the properties that the collective has that are not apparent and explicit in the fundamental constituents. That's the kind of simplest version of what I would say. So that, just to repeat what I said, a city is not the sum of all its citizens and all its infrastructure. So, and that is a generic property of most collectives, and in particular complex systems. The other thing that is sort of goes along with that is that, and that's why it's called complex adaptive systems, is these systems are typically, and the systems we normally think about that have these emergent properties, are also, they're not fixed. They're continually adapting and evolving in response to external conditions, or even internal conditions for that matter. And so emergence also has, I think, a connotation of as being some property of a complex adaptive system, meaning that it is continually changing.
I was just speaking with Michael Levin, who works on complexity, biology, and intelligence at Tufts, and he made a very similar point about collectives that I'd never really thought about before. That he's never encountered an intelligent monad, and I might add that there are no living monads either. So a lot of the interesting things we care about all arise out of emergent properties.
Yes. No. By the way, I said that's exactly right. I just gave a talk at a conference on collective behavior. It was a general one, very general. And the point I make, there's no such thing as an individual human being. It doesn't exist. And the way I put it in terms of the kind of things I work on, I think about scale and the dynamics of scale. And I said, New York is 100 times bigger than Santa Fe, roughly. So the 100 Santa Fe's make up New York, meaning in terms of the number of citizens. But New York produces twice as many patents, twice as many ideas, if you like, if you use that as a proxy for ideas, as 100 Santa Fe's would. You know what I mean? So, and that is a reflection of the interaction and dynamics, the facilitating nature of a large city, that it brings more people together and so on. And so you could ask the question, if you took those 15 million people, which is either 100 Santa Fe's or one New York metropolitan area, and you took them away and you made each one of them a guru and stuck them on top of a mountain and let them meditate, and you could feed them as much as you like, or they'd have enough access to food so they don't die, but they're sitting on the mountain contemplating the universe. How many patents would they produce? Zero. Because
have you looked at this?
It's the idea of the guru sitting on top of the mountain is completely antithetical to what human beings are and the necessity of the collective, and therefore the emergent behavior.
Have you at all looked at this with regard to university size? And whether
we have. Yes, we've done some work. We've even published a couple of papers on universities, but we've done quite a bit of analysis, and it's quite complicated, needless to say, partly because what we did, this is just going off slightly on a tangent, there are about 6,500 colleges in the United States. So you said universities, but colleges and universities. They go from Harvard's and Stanford's down to some small community college and little private institutions and so on. And we looked at this whole list. And they're divided, of course, into various subcategories, like you're at a private, number one university, of a research university, major research university. But there are also public versions of those, like University of Michigan or Wisconsin. And so we looked at the differences, tried to look at the differences just from data. And one of the frustrating things about this work, being a physicist, we didn't have any real theory that we could develop, mathematical theory. But we had lots of data to see how this changes. And the only thing I can say is that the data simply reflected what the university sees as its function and mission, and what it's trying to, in my language, what it's trying to optimize. So Stanford is trying to optimize its research output, its education, and you can see that in the data. You can see in terms of the salary structure, rewards, and so forth. Doesn't care much about education, truly. It's primarily, it's research oriented, and so on. And whereas a small college is much as education, some of the obvious things, but there are all kinds of non-obvious things. But anyway, I don't know if there's much point in spending a lot of time on that. But it was a very interesting exercise. And the one practical thing we try to get out of it, which is still a work in progress, was in fact to use this as a kind of, this is a bit arrogant the way I'm going to say it, is a kind of science-based process for ranking universities. That is not just the kinds of things US News and World Report does, but using some of these metrics to say, once you've got this category of universities and they're trying to optimize this, relative to what the optimization is trying to achieve, how do these universities stack up? And that's very much a work in progress. But for all 6,500 of them, so it's quite a process, actually. And it may not succeed.
Well, the second big concept I just wanted to pin down a little bit more before we move on to some of the work in biology and cities is one that you've referred to a number of times already, and that's complexity. And on the face of it, I think to say that one studies complexity or that one is a complexity theorist, it sounds quite vague to somebody who isn't among the cognoscenti, and I don't think I'm one of them. But so we won't talk about definitions, but how do people at the SFI, yourself included, think of complexity in such a way that it's enough to unify researchers in a number of different fields?
Yes, so this is much vaguer, and no question. And when I first joined this community, this was still this was still a big topic of conversation, trying to have a more precise definition, if you like, and also asking a question that follows from it. Could you, in fact, imagine a universal theory of complexity, and which is sort of a corollary to a much bigger question? But so I don't try to define complexity, and I've sort of shrug it off. And I don't think I've ever called myself a complexity scientist, to be honest. I'm a physicist. That's how I identify myself, who works on problems that one could characterize as complex, and in fact are complex adaptive systems. And I would say most of the work that goes on associated with the Santa Fe Institute and other places that have spun off from it are really to do with something that you could call complex adaptive systems. And I've just already referred to them in terms of emergent properties. But, typically there are systems that have a huge number of agents or constituents that are interacting and evolving, and are ones that have many different scales emerge from that. Both in terms of your body, you have obviously, nanosecond processes going on all the way through to your entire lifespan, which is maybe up to a century. So all those time scales are working together. And one of the big challenges, of course, in trying to understand a complex system is, in fact, how do those multiple scales, both in terms of both space and time, how do they work together? I mean, how does that all happen in a coherent way so the system can remain sustainable? And of course, that's now an enormous question for the entire planet. I mean, because the entire planet is, of course, a complex adaptive system containing a huge number of agents in it with multiple scales, both, again, spatial and temporal, with these levels of emergent properties. So I think, and crucial in it, which makes it so hard, is, of course, not just these multiple levels, but also the fact that the system is continually evolving, especially in reaction to externalities. So that's sort of a summary. And oh, by the way, I think one of the things I should add to that is that I think it's useful to compare the word complex with complicated. Here's an example. So think of a Boeing 787. That is, I would say, extremely complicated, but, and I'm stretching it here, not complex. Now, why I say that is because somewhere in Boeing Aircraft Company, there's a big book that tells you how to build a Boeing 787. That's what they do. Which means, in principle, that an intelligent person could build a 787. There's an algorithm. You just follow. Now, of course, you can't do it. You have to have. But in actually building the 787, you create almost certainly a complex adaptive system. And that's what Boeing did, because you have to have all the suppliers and all the supply lines, and you have to have all these different kinds of workers with different technical skills. And you form a community that has to do this, and you have to make sure that, the engineers are doing their job, and the guy sweeping the floors, building the aircraft is doing it. All these things are happening at multiple levels, and that's the complex system, the complex part of a Boeing 787, not the machine itself. It's the structure or the process or the networks that are the kind of underneath the surface that you don't see that is producing that machine. So that's complex, and that is, of course, again, adaptive. A machine is typically not adapting. I mean, it makes that flight time and time again, And that's it. That's what it does. Your car does the same thing. It doesn't evolve in any way.
Right. It
And
also doesn't have multiple levels of
and does have
complexity.
multiple layers. So it's, it is what it is. And so I think it's very important to distinguish complicated from complex. And one of the extraordinary things about the universe, I think, is that the universe out there seems to be just complicated, not very complex. I mean, all the complexity seems to be here on this planet, as far as I can tell. As far as we know, no. I mean, you could say the clouds of Venus are complex because clouds, hydrodynamics is a sort of complex system. It's not very adaptive, but complex adaptive systems so far only exist on this planet. This messy planet seems to be the only place in the universe that we know of. Elsewhere, it's all simple. That's why, you can have Sean Carroll on your program, and he can tell you all about the wonders of cosmology and quantum mechanics and all the rest. He can write down, here's the crucial point, he can write down, I mean, he didn't do it on your program probably, but he can write down the equations. And there's just a few of them. There aren't very many. And that whole thing, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. One equation, two equations, that encompasses an enormous amount. You can't do it for a city. You can't do it for your body. You would have to, and put it slightly differently, if you insist on having the mathematical physicist view of the world, and you insist that in the end it is all of that nature, you could imagine writing down an equation for everything that composes of your body. And I would contend there is effectively an infinite number of equations that it would require, which would mean it's useless.
And based on this way of thinking about complex adaptive systems, cities and organisms both have multiple levels of sophistication. They're always changing and so on. Would you agree then that one of the purposes, I mean, just putting this all together, one of the purposes of this line of research is drawing connections, in this case, scaling laws, one of them, between different complex adaptive systems?
Yes. So one of the things that is sort of, a corollary of having this worldview is that it is inherently interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. It inevitably means that you're thinking across traditional boundaries, and I think that's one of the great contributions of the Santa Fe Institute, was not just putting, quote, the word complexity and complex adaptive systems, so to speak, on the map, but also really showing what a transdisciplinary collaboration is. I mean, when I sort of laugh sometimes when people say, yes, at Stanford we have lots of these transdisciplinary, the high-energy physicist is working with the atomic physicist. And I think you must be kidding. I mean, you tell me, what you have to tell me is that the anthropologist is working with an economist and a mathematician on some problem to do with, pre-Columbian cities or, I don't know what, the emergence of language in Bali. I don't know. I mean, then I'm interested. That's so that's what happens at the Santa Fe Institute. And it's quite extraordinary that it happens. And the Santa Fe Institute is just this facilitator of bringing those people together who are, they choose it themselves. They self-select. We do go out, obviously, if you hear, we do try to get people into the orbit, but the vast majority, I would say well over 90% of the people associated with the Santa Fe Institute are self-selected. They come there. One of the mechanisms, by the way, since we're on it, we have lots of workshops and working groups. They're sort of on a continuous basis on all kinds of fantastic subjects. Also some mundane subjects, of course, but we do have a lot of these workshops and typically in organizing those, organizers are encouraged to invite people that haven't been to the Institute and might be interested and so on. And that's how many people get involved with the Institute. Many come, and might enjoy a few days, but decide this is not their cup of tea. It's not of interest, or they think it's all flaky or whatever. That's it. But so it's an interesting, distributed, loosely connected, sometimes very strongly connected community that is a very interesting, different model than the canonical university structure, and is very complementary. And most people that are associated with the Santa Fe Institute have appointments in institutions, in major, academic institutions. So it's a kind of hybrid.
Well, thank you very much for putting up with my 45 minutes of context setting questions.
That's great.
Okay, good. Well, let's get started, though, finally, with a basic scaling law, though you've already mentioned Clymer's law. But I should mention that your book, Scale, it's not only wonderfully written, but it's a compendium, definitely a compendium of interesting facts and tidbits without even getting to the theory. But so why do all animals tend to have the same number of heartbeats per lifetime?
Oh, boy, that's
that's a good one.
Yeah, it's a good one. There's a workshop we're running beginning Wednesday through Friday, which is called The Limits of Immortality. Actually, it's IM has got brackets around it, so it's kind of an ambiguous limit. So it goes to a little bit to this question, but and I'm giving a talk on that. So funny enough, I was just looking at this question in terms of preparing my little talk. So there are these scaling laws. They existed before I certainly came on the scene, as I said, and I was intrigued by them, and I started working on them. And this is an answer to your question, but I need to give some background. And I asked myself the question: how is it that all these things line up on this straight line? By the way, for those that aren't familiar, typically these scaling laws are what we call mathematically power laws. You don't have to know technically what that means, but here's what it means sort of in English. So the Kleiber's law that I mentioned goes from a mouse to an elephant, for example. Actually goes to a whale, goes from a shrew to a whale, actually, which is a factor of 100 million. And to the 8th in size. And if you were to make a graph, if I were to give you the data, I gave you the weight of the animal and its metabolic rate, and I said, plot this. And you started plotting it on a sheet of graph paper, and you did it in the usual linear way. So you go, 1 gram, 2 grams, 3 grams, 4 grams, 5 grams, and all the way up to a whale, which is 100 million grams. I did the calculation, but I don't know you'd have to have a sheet. If you were sitting in Palo Alto, that sheet of graph paper would extend way beyond San Francisco, to get it on, because it's 100 million. So that's not the way you plot it, obviously. So this is a lead up to saying you obviously have to do something much more condensed. And the way you do it is you plot it by factors of 10. Instead of going at 1, 2, 3, you go 1, 10, 100,
logarithmic
1,000, logarithmically. That's called So you plot it logarithmically, both in terms of weight and metabolic rate. And when you do that, and this was the point of origin of Kleiber's law, you see a straight line, which is kind of amazing, the simplest possible thing in the most complex system in the universe. I mean, it's incredible. Not only that, the slope of that line is approximately 3/4. And that has all kinds of amazing consequences, which we can talk about in a moment. But and as I said earlier, if you look at any physiological quantity that you can measure, or any life history event, life history meaning how long you take to mature, your growth rate, how long you live, how many children you have, they all scale like this too. And all of them, and here's what's remarkable that I didn't emphasize before, have slopes analogous to that 3/4 for metabolic rate that are simple multiples of 1/4, number 4. So you ask yourself, and I ask myself, when the hell does this number 4 come from? Why 4? And just a side editorial comment, how come in biology, this wasn't some huge begging question overhanging biology. That the number of genes scales with this quad. I mean, it's like it permeates everything. So I thought, that's what I worked. So it turns out you ask yourself, what is it that is common to all life? Well, if you think in terms of complex systems, it's hundreds of these agents, millions of these agents. You have 10 to the 14th, 100 trillion cells make up your body. And they have to act in a, roughly speaking, well, they have to be supported in a, roughly speaking, democratic and efficient fashion, and also in a highly coherent fashion so you can function. Well, how do you do that? Well, you know how you've done it. You are a bunch of networks. That's how you did it. That's who you are. You're a bunch of networks. The most prominent of which, that we're most familiar with, are, well, the two most prominent are our cardiovascular system and our brains. But everything is, our renal system, our bones are even networks, of course. But respiratory system, we're a bunch of networks. And so I thought, well, all organisms have to have networks. Maybe it is the mathematical, physical properties of these networks that is constraining everything in some way. Now, so I put together a bunch of principles for these networks, and they have to transcend design because you're not a tree. And by the way, the other remarkable thing about these laws, it wasn't just true for, say, mammals, but it was true for plants, trees, which is kind of amazing because they're completely different to us. I mean, but they're still networks. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, it was writing down, mathematizing a bunch of ideas about these networks, putting them into mathematics, and then working all that out that you could explain the quarter power scaling laws. And a crucial element, an absolutely crucial element, huge assumption, is that, for example, of the networks that we are made of, the ones that are actually, the ones that have evolved are ones that in some sense are optimized. And so the idea was that take our circulatory system, of the infinite possibilities that our circulatory system could have, the one that has evolved is the one for all of us, not just all human beings, but all mammals and all mammals that have ever existed. The one that has evolved is the one that minimizes the amount of energy your heart has to expend in order to pump blood through that system in order to supply cells so that you can then function. So very simple idea, but the idea is you want to minimize the amount of energy you use to stay alive, to live, to function, hunt and gather, so that you can maximize the energy you can allocate to sex, reproduction, and the raising of your offspring, which is Darwinian fitness. So you want to maximize. So it's a different way of expressing the classic optimization that is implicit in the idea of the survival of the fittest and the idea of Darwinian fitness. So, and I'm not going to go out, there's no point in this in trying to tell you anything about the way the mathematics goes, but suffice it to say that when you work it all out, amazingly out pops all those scaling laws, and which is very satisfying and very nice. And most important in this was that now there's a personal bit that I was working on this on my own, and then the serendipity took place that I was contacted by someone that knew me well at the Scientific Institute, who said that there was a well-known biologist, ecologist, this guy Jim Brown, who was becoming associated with the Scientific Institute, who was looking for some physicist he could talk to try to understand these scaling laws. And I couldn't believe it. I said, my God, that's amazing, because I said, I know this sounds weird, but not only have I been working on them, I understand them, and I understand their origin, I believe. Well, it turns out that was a little bit hasty. It was true to some extent, to a large degree, but it needed a lot of time working with Jim Brown and his then student Brian Inquist, to get all the I's dotted and the T's crossed and get it all straight, because I knew no biology. All the biology I did to do the mathematics, I just went in those days to the library. This is pre being able to Google it. I went to the library and just studied books on physiology and on ecology and on natural selection and sort of picking up in the gutter kind of thing. And it was wonderful to have Jim, who is a wonderful scientist, be able to really explain things and tell me what's important and what isn't and so on. And that was absolutely crucial. Anyway, we got it straight, and then we published this paper showing how all these scaling laws derive. 50, 75 of them, I don't know, for both mammals, plants, trees, but in different systems and so on. And then it grew. Then we took it into now you have a theory. This is one of the wonderful things about physics, I think, is that once you have sort of general principles, you can apply it anywhere. So we applied it to things like growth to understand growth. Why is it, why do you grow quickly and then stop? Well, the usual things, then some gene turns off. Well, it turns out you don't need genes. The theory automatically does it. It does it. The fact that metabolic rate scales as mass to the 3/4, that means that slope is going up less than linearly, which means in English, you double the size of an organism, you would think naively you need twice as much food because there's twice as many cells. No, you only need 75%. You save 25%. That's the quarter. And that's because this network is constraining you and optimizing the system. And so the supply, when you grow and you eat, you metabolize, send metabolic energy through networks, it goes to the cells. For you and me, it repairs the cells, it feeds the cells, it replaces ones that died. But when you were 10 years old, some of that energy was going to make new cells. And so, and that's the demand. The demand of the system is to make new cells. And that's kind of a linear process, just keep adding them. And the demand is linear, but the supply is the metabolic rate constrained by the network, which is sublinear. It's only got this increasing 75% with every doubling, but the demand is demanding 100% with every doubling. Well, eventually the supply can't keep up with the demand, and you stop. So when you do the mathematics, it fits perfectly on these wonderful growth curves of organisms, and you get a universal theory of growth and so on. So you can do all kinds of things once you have it, and we've done all kinds of things. And it's been very satisfying. And by the way, one of the nice kind of images for me is that, when you just look at mammals, we all recognize they have similarities. That's obvious. Otherwise, they wouldn't be called mammals. But, they're so different. But what this theory says and what the scaling laws say is that even though the whale lives in the ocean and the elephant has a trunk and the giraffe a long neck, and, we walk around on two legs and the mouse scurries around, actually, to kind of 80, 90%, in terms of anything that you can measure, we're just scaled versions of one another. You are a scaled down giraffe, actually. Not your neck. Your neck is an outlier in that, obviously. But otherwise, in terms of most things you can measure, almost everything measure, you are, which is kind of, and in fact, since the whole biosphere satisfies these laws, it's kind of very spiritual. There's something about the fact that we all are sort of similar. We all have these networks, and they're all constrained in the same way. We don't even know that the mathematics is at work. Those trees in the forest, when you walk through, look like some random bunch. The leaves look arbitrary. But in fact, when you examine them through this lens and you look at the data, they satisfy these scaling laws. They satisfy these laws. They're obeying these laws. It's not arbitrary, that forest. It's highly constrained with great regularity. And so it's wonderful to be able to reveal that through these principles, which has made me very philosophical in my old age.
I think I missed, though, why, for instance, we have the same number of heartbeats as a
Yeah, so
mouse.
now I'm sorry. Yeah, I told you I would get carried. This is my problem. Sorry. I'm so sorry. So all of this I did in order to understand why I'm going to die soon, basically.
Yes, yes.
I mean, that was my motivation. And so here's the point. That scaling law of metabolic rate, that the slope going as 3/4, less than linear, means that per cell, if you look per cell, the metabolic rate of a cell is decreasing with size. That is, the same cell in your body, in a dog's body, your liver cell and a dog's liver cell are basically the same. But in the dog's body, it's working much harder, following this 25% rule. And in a cat, it's working even harder. And in a mouse, it's working even harder. So there's this progression, and you can calculate how much harder. But if it's working harder, it's doing more damage. It's damaging, it's creating entropy. It's wearing and tearing more. Therefore, this is the simple version of the argument. Therefore, it wears out faster. Therefore, in a systematic way, small things die sooner than big things in a predictable, systematic way, following this quarter power, this kind of 25% rule. And indeed they do. So the idea is that the metabolic rate, just to repeat, the metabolic rate is increasing less than linearly, which means that on a per cell basis, per cell metabolic rate is decreasing. Cells are working less hard. The bigger you are, therefore you live longer because you're creating less entropy, less damage on the one hand. So it's decreasing following this 25% rule. On the other hand, heart rates, which is part of the circulatory system, like all times in this, are all determined again by cellular rates. But cellular rates are, in fact, increasing. These rates are increasing with time. So heart rates, I'm sorry, I said it backwards. Cellular rates are decreasing. So heart rates are decreasing systematically. And in fact, you look at the data. So the theory predicts, you have to, of course, I'm saying these in words, but you have to, of course, work out from the theory. Heart rates are decreasing with time, with size. Heart rates are decreasing from this 25% rule. Now, if you're doing less damage with cell following this 25% rule, the consequence of that is that lifespan increases by 25% with each doubling. I mean, it's just the opposite. You're doing less damage, so it takes much longer to do the same amount of damage following this 25% rule. So you have these two phenomena taking place, all coming from the constraint of the network on cells. On the one hand, heart rates are decreasing with size, with 25%. On the other hand, lifespan is increasing with 25%. And when you multiply them together, so you multiply heart rate decreasing with 25%, lifespan increasing by 25%, you multiply them together, the two 25% cancel each other. So you have this very simple consequence. Lifespan times heart rate is the same for everybody. The two 25% are canceled. But what is heart rate times lifespan? That's just the number of heartbeats in a lifetime. So the theory predicts, and the data confirms, that the number of heartbeats in a lifespan is the same whether you're a shrew that lives for just over a year and has a heart rate of, 1,200 times a minute, or a blue whale which lives for 125 years and has a heart rate that is, I don't know, I think it's something like 15 to 20 beats per minute. They they both have the same, and it's about 1.5 million, a billion and a half. I'm sorry, 1.5 billion heartbeats. And this is a good segue actually to cities, because that's what we had once upon a time. Before we, when we were hunter gatherers and so on, when we were non socioeconomic human beings, I mean, when we were part of the biosphere. So when we were part of the biosphere, our metabolic rate was exactly what it should be, which it is. It is now. I mean, it's high, and I'll say something about that in a minute. But beginning with the discovery of language, the evolution of language, the discovery of agriculture, becoming sedentary, and then writing, and therefore, at that time, the discovery of economies of scale, that is, the two of us working together can do more than each of us working individually on a project. So getting the idea of community being producing greater efficiency, and the coming of agriculture so that we can be sedentary led to communities and into cities. That changed everything. That separated us from the rest of the biosphere. And just to completely jump ahead, that we've gone from having, one thing I didn't say, I talked about the scaling of metabolic rate, but I didn't say what our metabolic rate is. Well, you know what it is. It's 2,000 food calories a day, on the side of your cereal box, roughly speaking, it's 2,000, whatever it is. But most people don't realize is that 2,000 food calories a day, that's energy per unit time, is the equivalent to about 90 watts. So the amount of energy you need to stay alive is the equivalent to an old incandescent light bulb, which is unbelievable. I mean, biology is absolutely extraordinarily efficient. We are unbelievably. I mean, that's unbelievable.
Unfortunately, because I'd like to eat about 6,000 calories a day.
Yeah. Well, some do. If you're a major, my son was a great rower, and he was using, I think, 7,000 calories a day.
Wow.
I mean,
I'm jealous of that. I actually eat 4,000, so that's still a good number, but not.
Why? Do you work out a lot? Are you
I do.
Oh yeah, then you would have to. Yeah, but me, I'm a sedentary person, and and then when you get old, your metabolism goes way down. So I probably use much less than 2,000 now, but that's only 90 watt, 90 to 100 watts. So before we evolved from sort of hunter gatherers, our basal. I should say this again. Our basal metabolic rate, which is just how much you need just to stay alive. So you could think of it while you're asleep. I don't know. That's about 90 watts. If you add in that, all the hunting and gathering you got to do, move around, get food, look after the kids. As a hunter-gatherer, that adds about a factor of 2 or 3 for all animals systematically. I mean, whatever their basal was, multiplies somewhere between 2 and 3. That's their total metabolic rate. And there are people on this planet there are still hunter-gatherers in the Amazon and in Borneo that only use their total metabolic rate is 300 watts. But now you can ask the question, once you have communities and cities and all the marvelous things that we have, and then we start this unbelievable, mad adventure, wonderful adventure that we've been on for the last 10,000 years, leading us to be here, me in Santa Fe, you in Palo Alto, being able to do these marvelous things within this incredibly short period of time. You can ask, what's our metabolic rate now? Well, of course, our biological basal metabolic rate is still 90 watts, where yours is twice that because you work out so much. But for most of us, it's around still 2,000 food calories a day. But your social metabolic rate, your active metabolic rate, equivalent to what the hunter-gatherers are, is now 11,000 watts. instead of 100 watts. We are 50 to 100 times more than we should be. About 50 times more than we should be for active. So we're way off. And you could turn that around and ask, how big an animal are each of us in the United States? And we're sort of equivalent to about 30,000 kilograms. Each one of us behaves as if we were. We're about not quite the size of a blue whale, but we're about a dozen elephants, each one of us.
Is the social metabolic rate sort of taken by dividing the energy that goes into a city by the amount of people?
Roughly, very roughly. So it is, so the idea then, and that's why I say this is a good segue to cities, because it is because of going back to what I said before, we are social collective organisms. We are part of a community, and we can't be removed. We can't exist outside of that in some form. So when I say that social, that's why I call it social metabolic rate. You are, of course, not just you. There's all your clothes. There's your cell phone. There's your automobile. There's the roads. There's the building you're in. There's Stanford. There's the Bay Area. All of these are part of you. You carry that with you. That is who you are. And each one of us has some of that, piece of that, inevitably, to varying degrees. But on the average, that number is about 11,000 watts. So exactly what you just said. It's pretty much, roughly speaking, how much energy is in the city or the country. It depends on what unit you want to take, and divide that by that. And that's how much each of us needs. Whereas if you took the hunter-gatherer community, that number would be, 250, 300 watts.
Well, before we execute on this segue to cities, though, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, both on behalf of me and our listeners, whether or not your research has pointed to ways of surpassing these limits on human mortality.
That's human longevity. Well, that's what this workshop is a little bit about. Well, our natural lifespan, if we were like, in the biosphere, it's not that people didn't live to 60 or 70 or even 100 as hunter-gatherers, but few and far between, relatively speaking. But I think the lifespan of a human being averaged over the entire globe in 1830 was about 34. And I think in the United States, in the 1880s, it might have risen to 45 or 50. So your if you were still American, your great-great-great-grandfather was only expected to live 45, 50. My father was born in 1914. His expected lifespan was 60, and he lived to 61, actually. So that's been increasing. And so we have expanded longevity. We've done the most fantastic thing. It's gone from being 30 to 40 years, which is our kind of natural biospheric lifespan, to about 80. So we've done something, no one did it. It wasn't, Jeff Bezos or or Larry Page wanting to live forever and keep their billions, which I don't deny. That's fine. But, they want to pour money. They're desperate to get to live forever. But we've already doubled it. We doubled it extraordinarily. And but a large part of that being cities. That is what cities have done, despite the image of cities being, filthy and dirty and full of disease. They've also supplied something that we didn't have ever, and that is clean water for everybody. Sewer systems. That had the biggest effect. No one washed themselves, except a few aristocrats, until probably about 1880. I'm exaggerating. I'm making a cartoon out of it, but roughly speaking, people rarely wash themselves. In the terms of given relative to what we do today. that had a huge effect. And then, of course, obviously, all the amenities of a city, and then followed by all the advances in medicine, which have added a great deal. And probably the biggest advances have been, the combination of superb surgery and, and antibiotics of various kinds. Those have been probably the two biggest. But the biggest effect has been the communal urban phenomena, rather than all the medical stuff. So that's the one thing. So I just want to give that as a background, but you could still ask. So, there's this theory of why it is you die, and you can ask, how can you change it? Well, it's tied to metabolism. So the obvious thing is lower your metabolism. So eat less. Don't eat. What you should do is, not eat 4,000, you should eat 1,000, maybe. So, and it goes roughly, so that anyone knows, I think if my memory, I think it goes as the cube root of metabolic rate. So you can increase, if you decrease by your metabolism by a certain amount, take 1/3 of that, and that'd be the increase in your lifespan, roughly speaking. So that's the formula. So that was one way, and that's called caloric restriction. And experiments were done on mice and monkeys and so on. Some of it's a bit controversial, but mostly it supports that very well, actually. So you can do it. But of course, you have to be willing to starve yourself, but you don't have to go that far. If you eat less, of course, there's many other factors involved. So it's a bit simplistic, but that's one thing. The other thing that you can do is you can recognize that metabolic rate depends upon temperature, ambient temperature. We're unique, basically, we and the birds, basically, we're unique that it's one of our great strengths is that we're homeostatic. We don't, the temperature may go to freezing outside, but you don't freeze. But, you don't slow down. But everything else out there slows down, everything. And we and the birds keep going. We have this mechanism, this thermostat in us. But everything out there changes. And one of the things that most people don't realize is that that's an enormous effect. That's exponential. That's an exponential effect, which means in English, roughly speaking, a small change in temperature has a huge effect. That's why, if you want to explain to your mother why 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees change in the ambient temperature, which seems like something diddly, should have such a profound effect on the environment, because it's exponential. It's an exponential effect, and everything changes. Growth rates change by sort of 1 degree, changes, I forget the numbers, maybe by 15, 20%, which is enormous. So one thing you can do if you are an organism is you always try to stay cold, but warm enough that your metabolism is active enough that you can still go around and get food. So you find, and that's mostly what they do, actually. Now, we can't do that very easily. We're stuck. But maybe you could imagine, and I know they have done experiments on mice. There are drugs you can give to lower the body temperature, and they live longer, is the claim. And that agrees with the theory. No doubt you could develop those for human beings, and you could lower your body temperature, sort of 98.5, maybe to 95, and so on. That's great. If your idea is to live longer, maybe that will, but God only knows what all the other health consequences will be. And so it is with all of these things. Now, the thing that you realize, that's the last thing I'm going to say about changing longevity, there is a balance in you. You wear and tear, as I said, But of course, what I didn't say is you also repair yourself. You're continually repairing yourself. And you know that trivially, if you cut yourself, you repair, but you're continually repairing yourself. But it takes a lot of energy to repair. It takes a lot of energy to repair. So that we have evolved so that we allocate sufficient metabolic energy so that we live till about age 35 to 40, which is no accident, because by then you've produced 10 to 15 offspring, and then you die, which is what we sort of on the average, so to speak, used to do. So I don't know how old you are, but I'm twice that. So I've totally gone way out. And, and most of us have. And that's what all this other stuff I've talked about, the social stuff, has done. So the other way of doing it is to, of course, allocate more energy to repair. And that's what all this thing about shortening of telomeres and all the rest you might have read about is you can intervene by either biochemically, genetically modifying so that you increase energy devoted to repair, and that will increase lifespan. And you could do that, but cautionary word is, and I said this near the beginning when you asked about complex systems and so on, one of the marvelous things about us is we contain all these huge different scales, both spatial and temporal, and they're all intertwined and interrelated and beautifully synced with one another. And now you're going to use a technical term, fuck around with that system. So, you have to worry, what are the unintended consequences of doing any of these things in a system that's so beautifully and exquisitely tuned so that you can operate only at like a light bulb and live to 100 years already. My view, today happens to be the Jewish Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, so I'm not a religious person, but, I have a kind of spiritual side. Delight in that. Delight that you only use 90 watts and you're going to live for 100 years if you're lucky. What more? So I have a very jaundiced view, as you can tell, of this. Sorry, that's editorial. That's not me as a scientist, by the way. Mm-hmm. That's me as, this weirdo human being.
Well, now finally moving toward cities. I think there are two natural questions to ask given everything we've just been discussing. And these two questions that come to mind are, why don't cities seem to die the way that organisms do? They just keep growing. And then, like Rome. Rome's a good example. It's been hard to kill over the centuries.
Can't kill cities.
Then the other question, I'm sure it's tied to this, is how the metabolism of cities scales with size.
Yes, very good. Yeah, so, having done all this work, it was very natural to think about extending it to cities and companies, because they're both network systems, and both in the literature you often biological or organismic and metaphors are used to describe them very often in the literature. So it's very natural to turn to them and ask the kinds of questions you just asked. And in fact, the question that inspired me was exactly the one you asked. Why is it that cities seem to be, on the scale of human life anyway, sort of immortal? Or put it slightly different, it's extremely difficult to kill a city. We, of course, know ones that have died, especially in more ancient times. But, the example I give is, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We dropped atom bombs on them. And 25 years later, they're sort of up and thriving. So it's very hard to kill them. People talked about the death of Detroit and New Orleans, which was completely absurd. And both are doing fine. So it's hard. It's hard to kill a city. And the question I ask is, why is it hard to kill a city, but simple to kill a company? I mean, it's kind of bizarre to think that we don't have a TWA or a Pan Am or Sears Roebuck or Montgomery Wards. And it's weird to think that one day we may not have a Google or a Microsoft. I mean, when they're powerful and strong, it seems like they're going to be around forever. But the history has been that they don't live. In fact, the analysis we did eventually was to show that even once you've posted on the New York Stock Exchange, so you've gone public, so you've gone through a gestation period, and you think you're strong, your expected lifespan is about 10 years. So most publicly traded companies aren't going to last very long. It's very unusual for a company to last even 50 years. And some companies can last several hundred years, but very, very few. So there's that difference. Whereas a city, as you just said, Rome or Baghdad, they're still here. And they also, roughly speaking, keep growing. So what is that? So it was natural to take this work and ask a series of questions that we asked in biology, and in particular ones, do cities scale? Is, just as I said whimsically, you're a scaled down elephant and a blown up mouse, is Los Angeles a scaled down New York and a scaled up Chicago, which is a scaled up Santa Fe, even though, like the animals, they look completely different. They have different histories, geographies, even different cultures. But we do recognize all of them as cities, just as we recognize all those things as mammals. And indeed, once you start thinking about it, your first thought is, gee whiz, Los Angeles and New York, they're so different. But, as you actually think about it as to what it is, you realize actually almost everything about them is the same, because they all have people, they all have buildings, they have roads, they have, et cetera, et cetera. They all have all the same things, and they have to have all those same things. They all, they have to have garbage workers and they have to have lawyers, so it's like, well, maybe all those differences are rather superficial. And as I said, they're networks. And the important thing to recognize is the obvious networks, the roads and the electrical lines, and water lines, that's one thing. But it turns out the most important thing, and this is the most important thing about a city, is its social networks. It's the networks of people. And to recognize that the whole point of a city is not all those buildings and roads and so on. That is just infrastructure or a stage, a facilitator to encourage social interaction. And the essence of a city, I know it sounds almost obvious, is to encourage social interaction in order to produce wealth and innovate, create ideas, and in order to raise quality of standard of life. And that's what they are. And it's, even though it may sound obvious, that has not been obvious in the history of urban studies, urban geography, urban development, political development of cities, and so on. It's always been focused on buildings. In fact, it almost always is. It's always focused on building new stuff. Look at the way you are, Stanford campus. My God almighty, it's all buildings,
Yes, it is.
names on them.
Crowding up everywhere.
Everywhere, and that's what every university is, and so anyway, but it's very similar. That's the focus, and it's very easy to forget why they're there. So that's important. Anyway, so it turned out, unlike the biology, I didn't say this. I did say Kaiba's law had been known since the 30s. Well, I guess I did say that all these other laws, many of them, were discovered or exposed in the 30s and 40s and 50s, even into the 60s. But the urban scaling, urban cities had not been looked at this way. Basically, there was almost no work had been done on. So this was a more difficult project in the sense that we also had to do a lot of data gathering, and luckily, by the time we turned our attention to that. We, by the way, was not the people. I had to also, I'd worked with biologists, ecologists. It was a highly multidisciplinary group with the biology, but very little of that carried over to the cities. So I had to form new collaborations. And one of the main ones was someone had been a postdoc also in high-energy physics at Los Alamos, a man named Luis Betancourt, who joined me at the Santa Fe Institute, eventually moved there, and then now runs some fancy schmancy institute funded to some humongous degree in the University of Chicago. He's the director there. But he and then others, Jose Lobo, others, but the task was then, scraping around looking for data to ask, do cities scale? Is New York scaled up Los Angeles and scaled up Santa Fe? Well, we got all that data, and we got it on two parts. There are two parts, and the data separated into two parts, and the way I've already talked about it. That is, one was its physicality, the infrastructure, the buildings. So one of the first things we discovered, in fact, the first thing we discovered, I actually had the first work was with some European colleagues before the major collaboration, a man named Dirk Helbing at the ETH in Zurich, and his student. And what did we do? We found, I think the first thing was showing that gasoline stations scaled. So you plotted the number of gasoline stations versus the size of a city. And these were in European countries, and they scaled beautifully. And it looked just like biology. Exactly, it was sublinear, meaning it didn't go linearly, which meant that the bigger the city, the less gas stations you need per capita. Well, subsequently, with the bigger collaboration, we did this for all infrastructure, and we discovered that that any infrastructure, such as gas stations, length of all the roads, the electrical lines, the buildings, and so on, all scaled as if it were biology, as if it were just an organism. That is, it had this economy of scale. So, but the only difference being, instead of 25% saving with each doubling, you have a 15% saving. So that a bigger city is more efficient in that sense than a smaller city, in the same sense that a bigger organism is more efficient than a smaller one. So, except for this 15 versus 25%. So that was very nice and very satisfying. And, we could imagine having a theory very similar to the biological theory based on networks. So that was very nice. But we also started looking at socioeconomic quantities, which are really the essence of a city. And that is things like, the number of flu cases, the amount of AIDS cases, the wealth, the wages in a city, the number of patents produced in a city, therefore how innovative a city was, and the number of restaurants in a city. Anything you could get that was socioeconomic in character. And we discovered something remarkable, namely that they all scaled in the same way, pretty much. And they all scaled. First of all, they all scaled. They scaled in a similar way, meaning the slope of the graphs plotted in this logarithmic fashion were similar, roughly around 1.15. So the other thing we discovered, they were bigger than 1 rather than less than 1. And that was, and in fact, one of the things that I've been embarrassed about, which I will say publicly, is that I didn't predict that. I didn't predict a priori. If we look at socioeconomic quantities, they're going to be bigger than 1, namely, instead of the bigger you are, the less per capita, that is, the less roads and gas stations per capita, like biology. But when you come to socioeconomic phenomena, if you think about it, you would have expected the bigger you are, the more per capita, the more people, the more interactions, the more ideas, the more disease, the more crime, the more wages, the higher the wages. And I didn't. In fact, the first time I saw the data at our little gathering of a group, I said, to the student, you got it wrong. That can't be right, because he got this 1.15. I said, screwed up somewhere. And then he said, no, I really was careful. And I said, no, you're wrong. Then a half hour later, as I sat there mulling over, I said, oh my God, what a schmuck. It's obviously it should be it should have been superlinear. So it was an interesting exercise, actually. So, and the amazing thing is not only all socioeconomic metrics scaled similarly, but it was the same across the globe, whether you looked in North America, Central America, Latin America, China, Japan, Europe, all looked the same. I mean, roughly speaking. And that was amazing. That meant that there was a universal dynamic that was going on, which was wonderful. You know, now we have the same kind of thing as in biology, so it was almost as if, I used to say this, as if along comes the Industrial Revolution and urbanization starts to slowly take off. And there was a big international convention in, let's say 1805. And they bring all the leaders of the world together and they say, look, we've just got this industrial revolution and we're going to be building lots of cities. Let's sit down and decide how we're going to build them. And we're all going to follow the same plan and so on. It was almost as if this had happened. Of course, it hadn't. In fact, all cities look different, and they're certainly across the globe. And yet, their systematics are the same. They all follow the same scaling laws, and there's kind of universality. And then you think, how in the hell did that happen? And then you realize, of course, that's what got me. I quickly realized, of course, the reason is that because I was still, when I first saw this, I was still thinking of cities primarily as buildings, infrastructure. Then I said, oh my God, of course. It's of course because cities are people. It's the people that are forcing all these things. It's the way people interact. It's social interactions. It's social networks. And social networking and social interactions between people are roughly the same across the globe. Roughly, independent of geography, culture, and history. We're human beings. We do recognize that people in Asia and Africa and Europe and America, we're the same thing. And we know our DNA is almost identical. And so it's not surprising that the thing we produced that facilitates our social interaction should be the same in terms of these properties that you can measure. I'm taking very much a physicist view, things you can measure. And so that's sort of interesting. That means you could start forming a real theory, which is quite challenging because you have two networks at play now. You have the infrastructural networks and the social networks, and they behave differently. And they're completely integrated. You're part of two networks. You're part of that infrastructural network that is Stanford, which is part of a bigger network, which is the Bay Area and so on and so on, California. So you're part of all that infrastructure, but you're also part of course, probably more importantly, part of a social network. You have your friends, you have your colleagues, and you have your family, and that's who you are. And those two are not independent. You're sitting on a network, on an infrastructural network. You're going to interact with your family through that infrastructure. So that's very hard to put into mathematics. Anyway, so that's where all that stands. And it's quite powerful to think of it all as sort of universal and all pretty much the same thing, and that you can have a real theory, science-based theory of cities to complement all the marvelous stuff that's been done before, which is much more kind of social science and more qualitative in its nature. And so this work has, for want of a better phrase, been called the science of cities. I'm not sure that's a very good phrase, actually. I don't like it particularly. It's come under that kind of umbrella. But it's now, when I started this, I wasn't terribly enthusiastic about it. I didn't think cities were so exciting and interesting. But as I got into it and I saw this marvelous patterns emerging, I got more and more interested and excited. But then I got truly excited when I realized that the whole future of the planet is completely dependent upon cities. And so if you're thinking about global sustainability, and therefore all the things that come under that umbrella, from global warming to energy and water and resources in general, financial markets and so on, all come under that. You better think about cities, and you better understand what that dynamic is. And so one of the things that I have moved into in very recently, work in progress, is taking these ideas for the whole planet, taking the whole thing and applying the same kind of thing and looking at global metrics and so on. And that's been quite fascinating, and it's quite, I don't know, depressing in a way, I'm afraid. It doesn't look for a good outlook if you look at the way these metrics are evolving within this framework. But anyway, so that's where that work stands. One of the major things I haven't talked about, and I'm happy to do so, which has profound consequences, is growth, which I only talked briefly about. I talked about for organisms that it was the sublinear economy of scale, 3/4 power, less than one, behavior of the supply, the metabolic rate, not being able to keep up with the growth, with the adding of cells, that leads to the cessation of growth. Here we have the opposite. We have that superlinear scaling. Now you have the opposite. Instead of supply not keeping up with demand, demand can't keep up with supply. I mean, supply completely overwhelms demand. And that's the society we live in. That's what gives us this great society we live in. We keep making more and more, and we have all these marvelous things because of that supply being superlinear. And so that's great. That's been wonderful. And the theory explains it through social networks. The fact that we doing things like this builds on things, and we build on more, and it gives rise to superlinear. But it has, and I don't know if you want me to talk about it, some very dark consequences, potentially dark consequences.
Mm-hmm. Well, sure. We'll move on to that. But just to recapitulate briefly, I mean, while organisms and cities both scale, the one sublinearly and the other superlinearly, organisms slow down with size, but cities speed up. And you attribute this to human psychology and the way we interact. And maybe a good example of concretizing this is with that patent example you gave, where if you take one guru on a mountaintop, you don't get patents, but the more people connect with one another, the more patents you get. And this results in what you didn't use this phrase in our conversation, I don't think, but in scale, you refer to it as the continually increasing pace of life. People walk more quickly in cities.
Exactly. So that's the other consequence of this theory. Just as in biology, I said the bigger, I don't know if I emphasized that, but things slow down, the bigger you are. Well, I talked about slower heart rates, but in general, the pace of life is much slower and you live much longer. In cities, the pace of life increases systematically with size. Things go faster. And in fact, viscerally, I think we all feel that. I mean, my God, pace of life now compared to when I was even your age, and certainly when I was a boy, is phenomenal. And in fact, that has huge psychological implications as well, because there's also that, when I was growing up, and probably even at your age, there was still this presumption that things don't change very quickly. I mean, we knew that, but, I'm in the same job for the rest of my life kind of image, which was certainly true in my father's time, but it was even true when I grew up. I mean, it was you choose a profession, you move into it, and that's what you're going to be doing. But not just a profession, but even in a job, you sort of expect to stay climbing up the ladder and so on. That was sort of the image. Of course, there were lots of changes and things and so on. But now that's, things, people are changing willy-nilly very fast, and society around you. I mean, my God, until last year, I had an iPhone 6. And these buggers at Apple, your neighbors down the road, of course, as part of the capitalist system, stopped supporting it. So the thing became basically dysfunctional. It worked fine, just became dysfunctional. You couldn't use it, nothing worked on it because they never upgraded and you couldn't upgrade. And it was getting more and more frustrating and I was getting more and more annoyed. So I bit the bullet last year and I bought my wonderful, lovely, it is so much better than the iPhone 6, no question, 14. But of course, like you, all last week and today, I get inundated to get the iPhone 15.
Yes.
1 year later, I mean, what kind of nut? This is completely nuts. Every year it's like, with all kinds of other bells and whistles, the best camera they've ever had. This camera is so much, I mean, who cares? So I'm sorry, this is polemics and I'm running off the rails here. But that is the way life is, faster and faster. And it has all kinds of interesting social, psychological consequences, which I think are playing out on the political scene. And we can maybe come back to that in a minute. But that is certainly what it is. And the data supports that life, it's hard to measure. What are the right metrics to measure? Well, there was this old data that you mentioned. I think you just said it, that we found that some people at Princeton had done on the speed of walking in cities that increased, and they followed pretty much what we said. But, the pace of life, I think everybody would agree, has definitely increased. Whether it agrees precisely with our theory, I don't know. We don't have enough data. But I was going to say one thing that is important that brings up cell phones is that this idea that it's all to do with social networks and the theory kind of conceptual framework is based on that. We've found a way of testing because our dear friends at MIT met a crazy, wonderful man named Carlo Ratti, who was a very fine architect and scientist, had got very turned on to the idea, he wasn't unique, but he got turned on, that you could use cell phones as a detector, that everybody has one. So if you get hold of the cell phone data, you know what everybody's doing, so you can measure social networks. Well, this is now been much used and well known. So we were some of the first to do that. And we got billions and billions of data of phone calls between people. And then we just measured the degree of social interaction based on those phone calls. It took a lot of analysis, detailed analysis of that. And it was very simple, the idea, you call me and 6 months later, I call you back. We define that we have a relationship. So that's an interaction. You could make it 3 months, you could make it 2 weeks. So 6 months was kind of arbitrary, you can change that to see how it affects the results. It doesn't much. But so you measure, and what you find is the prediction would be, if this theory is right, the number of social interactions as a function of city size should increase like this 1.15, like everything else. Sure enough, it did. So that was extremely satisfying. Let's see, I forget what question you asked originally on this line about...
Well, I didn't really have a question. I was just commenting on the pace of life increase that comes with this superlinear growth. But maybe this is a good time to segue, to use that word again, into the concerns, the sustainability of this unconstrained growth.
So one is this pace of life increasing, that somehow that's the price you pay. The price you pay for getting more ideas, more action, a sexier life, more opportunities, more buzz, and therefore, increasing by, material metrics anyway, material and quality of life, the price you pay is that it goes faster. That's one price. And I'll come back to what that might mean in a moment. But the other price is to do with growth. So one of the nice things is that this superlinear behavior, this more per capita the bigger you are, the consequence of that is that the supply is always outgrowing the demand. You're just getting more. Of course, that's what we have, all this excess, which goes into all the wonderful things we have. And that's great. So the theory is very nice because it kind of explains all that. But it has a very bad consequence, and that is goes under the name mathematically of something called a finite time singularity. And what that means in English is in some finite time in the future. Could be next week, could be next year, could be 50 years, but some finite time in the future, this growing curve that we all see and we're all part of, and it's exponential, by the way, faster than exponential, becomes infinite, which is completely loony. You can't have infinite number of AIDS cases or an infinite GDP or infinite number of patents. It's loony. And the theory tells you it's loony because it tells you that the system collapses. System then collapses. It comes up to this so-called singularity and collapses. And the mathematics of that, interestingly, is essentially identical to the mathematics that happens in a phase transition when, say, propane changes from a liquid to a gas. Something changes from a completely same stuff, same says propane, but in one form it's a liquid and all interconnected and together. On the other side of this transition, this phase transition, it's a gas, not interacting, not connected with each other. Well, it's the mathematics of what's the singularity, this finite, is very similar to that. So that's very bad. We don't want that. We don't want, most of us like what we have. We like this socioeconomic system for all its faults. And we've learned how to avoid it. We know how to avoid it. And this argument, of course, is the old argument begun by Thomas Malthus, who pointed out in 1780 or whatever, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where he already saw the beginnings of exponential growth, that he said this was not sustainable because you can't supply enough food to keep up with it. And he had in mind you just have linear growth of food, and that always gets beaten quite quickly by an exponential. And everybody poo-pooed it, those are rightly, economists and Marxists. Marx himself poo-pooed it, because Marx poo-pooed it, by the way, and many on which you would consider the left poo-pooed it, because he felt that it would lead to draconian consequences of the way society, if you took that literally, you would start stopping people, you'd have forced stopping people having babies, and you would kill off people. All kinds of terrible, is what he thought. Anyway, on the other hand, it did influence Darwin in terms of survival of the fittest, very much so. But economists said, look, this is totally simplistic because we innovate. It's not going to stay linear. We're going to find clever ways of producing food. And they're exactly right. And we've kept ahead of the curve the whole way in terms of food, including the famous Green Revolution of 50 years ago. Marvelous. But more importantly is that this approaching the singularity is cut off by having an innovation. So the idea is that you grow in this exponential or faster than exponential phase. You would hit a singularity and collapse, but you recognize that you can intervene by changing some conditions, because that growth has taken place within a certain given paradigm or major innovation. You've discovered bronze. That's why we say the Bronze Age, or iron, the Iron Age, or computer age. Now we call it the IT age, and so on. There's something that sort of dominates that period and that time and the way society behaves. And we're in one of those now, which is sort of the internet age, if you like, or some version of that. And so that leads, if you think about it, to what you have to do. If you're approaching this collapse, you have to intervene with some major innovation, some major paradigm shift. You have to reinvent yourself and start over again. So you grow, you intervene, you're going to collapse, you intervene, you start over again. But you're going to hit another singularity, so you better intervene again. So what it says is if you want to maintain open-ended growth the way we have, you have to have sequence of innovations or paradigm shifts, reinvent yourself. And well, that's what we've done. That's why we have all these different, we designate them. And that's great, but you don't get that for free either. That gets you out of the problem. But it has become, basically the dictum of economists and politicians. The whole society is based on that idea that you don't have to worry about that. You don't even have to worry about population growth because we're always going to innovate. We've done it and we're going to keep doing it. We just keep innovating, and we have. I mean, it's true. Absolutely. But here's the kicker. The problem is, in the theory at least, and indeed all the data strongly supports it, previous data, that you have to do it faster and faster in a systematic way. So, the time between, the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, was thousands of years, but the time between computers and the internet were 15 years. So, and the theory tells you how fast you speed up. And so you can make a kind of reductio ad absurdum argument that, yes, you can innovate to get yourself out of it, but it's not a solution. All it does is postpone. So that's the thing I introduce into it. All it does is postpone, and you got to do it again, but you have to do it much quicker this time. And next time, even quicker. So the reductio ad absurdum is you have to make a major innovation like the internet or AI kind of every year, which is nuts. You can't do, Apple may think they're doing it with this, but I'm talking about something, not some trivial 14 to 15 innovation, but some true innovation like the internet or what may be one like artificial intelligence, I don't know. So, and so you can't keep it up. So my image that I have in my head is one of being on treadmills. You're on a treadmill that's accelerating. That's the accelerating pace of life. But, at some stage, you're going to have to jump to another treadmill that is also accelerating. And that goes faster. And then you have to jump to another treadmill. But the trouble is, not only is each treadmill going faster, but you're going to have to jump from one treadmill to another at a faster and faster rate. So it's almost like a double exponent. It's like crazy. It's hard not to believe that the system isn't going to have a heart attack and collapse under that. So that's what it is. So the most recent work I've been involved in is to take data. So this is what I thought when we did this work on cities and thinking about it for the entire planet 20 years ago when we first did this work, or whenever the hell we did that work, maybe less than 15 years ago. But the data wasn't around, so I put it aside. And my collaborators, I think, thought I was a bit overly speculative, let's put it that way. But I then learned about a year or so ago, just as COVID was beginning, that someone named Will Steffen, who's one of the great proponents of the idea of the Anthropocene, an Australian who sadly died just a few months ago, had put together a whole bunch of global data. So treating the globe as a whole in the same way we were treating a city as a whole. So we took this data, and I had the equations all worked out, and lo and behold, it fit beautifully, the equations, and it projected a singularity, that we're heading boing, right towards a singularity. It's very hard, given the quality of the data and the way the mathematics work, to predict with any precision, unfortunately, at the moment. It's very much a work in progress. When that will be, it could be as soon as 15 years, might be 30 years. We're honing us. Work is definitely work in progress. And this work may turn out to be rubbish. I hope not. That's the data. And it's not published, so it shouldn't be taken too seriously, frankly. But I believe it. But it needs a lot more work. But it's just taking this idea that we did for the cities And as I say, just doing it for the planet as a whole. And it's very suggestive. So we'll see where that goes. But meanwhile, in any case, I had already felt very strongly when I was doing this work, before we had this latest stuff, that in addition to all the marvelous things that people are doing in trying to attack scientifically the question of sustainability, most of it is focused on global warming and the effects it would have on the environment, all of which is, of course, crucially important. But that's just one piece of the problem. Everything's interconnected. That's interconnected with markets and energy and food and so on. And one of the things you learn when you study complex adaptive systems is if you neglect one piece, you're going to screw up somewhere else. That's one of the lessons. And indeed, we sort of saw that great interconnectivity. I mean, with one of the greatest and quickest, consequences of a complex system in action, and that's the pandemic. So, there was this mutation of a virus in Wuhan, China, and within just months, you couldn't get flour. There was a shortage of flour. There was no football in Spain. There was riots in Paris. All these things happening from this mutation and this pandemic, all that you thought had nothing. Who would think that flour and yeast had anything to do with football in Spain or the United Kingdom? But actually, they're always connected. They are connected. I mean, extremely weakly, and for most of the time, completely irrelevantly. But if you forget that when something like this happens, you're in deep doo-doo. So we have to, in terms of what's happening globally, and we're thinking about sustainability, we better always also think systemically as well as locally. And I think that's the big lesson. And no doubt, most of the work should be done kind of, what I mean by locally, I don't just mean spatially and even temporally, but I mean on specific problems, for sure. Most of the work. But if you forget that that's only one piece, we're destined for big problems. So the last thing I'll say that will get me into real trouble is the effects of this increasing pace of time, because I believe that has been the cause of the great anxiety that exists across the planet. Because one of the most curious things that has happened in recent years is the rise of authoritarian governments and authoritarian leaders, including in this country. And it's kind of bizarre. I mean, we seem to be headed in exactly the wrong direction and naively thought it would continue that way. Greater liberalism, greater freedom, greater openness, et cetera, et cetera. The idea that democracy would spread, and this is all good. This is all considered good. And very quickly, suddenly, it all seemed to go the other way. So much so that even, I saw a sign in some riot somewhere saying, democracy is the great evil on the planet. Some people holding this sign. I mean, I couldn't believe it. Anyway, well, that's the way it is. And you wonder why is it, first of all, it's global, it's quite extensive. I mean, everywhere seems to be, in one form or another, having versions of this. I mean, it's true, we don't have an Adolf Hitler, although, Putin has a certain Stalinist tendencies, apparently. But, they're not like Stalin and Hitler, none of these people yet, hopefully never. But they certainly, their way of dealing with the world certainly seems to be framed by that kind of thinking. And you wonder why. And why do people vote for them in places where there is democracy and in huge numbers? And at the same time, the standard and quality of life by any material measure has been continuously increasing, basically. It's true, wages have stagnated and so on to some extent. But, the quality of standard of life relative to even 20 years ago is higher, certainly compared to 50 years ago, yet people are less happy, more angry, and more anxious. So here's my simplistic answer. Because of the pace of life has increased where we can't keep up with it. Most of us feel disconnected, disenfranchised, soulless, and so forth. And I think this is having a profound social and psychological effect. And, that idea that things are running away from us, even if and in fact, even more galling, we seem to be doing materially okay, sort of, but those people out there are pulling the rug from under us by doing these various things. So it's also no accident that Silicon Valley is also being attacked for what it does. And there's good reason for that in some instances. Anyway, that's my sort of pet speculative kind of trying to understand why this is happening. Because it's silly to try to explain Trump only by the fact that, yes, America had fascist tendencies in the 1930s, for sure. It had people like that, the Huey Longs and the, George Wallaces and so forth. Yeah, we've had that and so on. But it's weird that it would also be, and certain Hungary has always had a kind of fascist kind of mentality, as far as I can tell. I hope I'm not offending anybody. These have always been there. But I think it's ridiculous to try to explain each one because of its own history, geography, and culture. I think this is something much more global and universal that is going on and why it's all just interconnected. I mean, Modi in India, my Indian friends tell me it feels like a police state there now, which I can hardly believe. But, we're not there. I mean, we're far from that, no question. But to see these things arise in such quick opposition, I believe, is somehow to do with this increasing pace of life. And the science side of this is, how can we understand something truly extraordinary? Not that we've come to this place, but how was our brain able to adapt so quickly? Honestly, I mean, seriously, I mean, I cannot believe, when you think about it, with the same brain as we were 10,000, 100,000 years ago, hunting and gathering. I mean, we've got the same body, the same brain, the same people. And yet, that brain has been able to, you see little old ladies and little old men like me in the grocery store with their iPhones doing things. It's mind-blowing, they're able to do, people do it. But that raises the question, the same question you asked about longevity. What is the limit to being able to compute in your head, do these things? What is the limit to that adaptability? It's not infinite. I mean, that's absurd. Can't be infinite adaptability. So somewhere between infinite and where we are now, there has to be a place where the brain simply can't adapt quick enough to the changes. That's the problem.
Well, that is a very thought-provoking way in which to end. Geoffrey, this has been a terrific foray into complexity and the relationship between scaling and biology and cities. So thank you so much for having this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Hold on. If you haven't subscribed, liked, commented, or reviewed, that would be so helpful. And if you haven't yet, you could also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Robinson Earhart.